Learning to handle mistakes. On Tuesday morning, I walk into school feeling a bit anxious. My English class has been going well, but I know that I still make a lot of mistakes when I speak. As I sit down, I see my friend, Sarah, looking nervous, too. Our teacher, Mrs. Miller, smiles at the class and asks, "How is everyone feeling today? Did anyone practice their English over the weekend?" Sarah raises her hand and speaks up. "Mrs. Miller, I want to practice speaking with people around me, but I feel scared of making mistakes. I don't want to sound silly. I'm afraid people will laugh at me. Can you help me?" Mrs. Miller's smile grows a little wider, and she nods. "That's a great question, Sarah. Actually, making mistakes is a very important part of learning. There are a lot of opinions about this topic, but I'd like to share what I believe. I have some experience because, like you, I also learn new languages. Right now, I'm learning Spanish. Everyone is surprised. Our teacher is learning a new language, just like us." Mrs. Miller continues, "When I speak Spanish, I don't worry about making mistakes. Do you know why? It's because when I was a little girl learning my native language, I didn't care about mistakes. My only goal was to share my ideas and have fun with language. That's all I cared about." I raise my hand and ask, "But, Mrs. Miller, how do you stop feeling embarrassed when you make mistakes?" She nods thoughtfully and says, "Good question. The key is to focus on your ideas, not your mistakes. Imagine that you're a 2-year-old child. A child learning to speak makes many mistakes, but they don't worry. They keep trying. By the time they are 3, they make fewer mistakes. And by age 4, they speak quite well." The class listens closely. Sarah looks a bit relieved. Mrs. Miller continues, "Think of it this way: when you're speaking English, you are like that little child learning to talk. Mistakes are just a normal part of that learning process." Another student, Amir, raises his hand. "But Mrs. Miller, what if we never stop making mistakes? I want to speak English well." Mrs. Miller laughs kindly. "Oh, Amir, don't worry. As you keep using English, you'll make fewer and fewer mistakes. Think about it like learning to play a musical instrument, like the piano. When you first start, it's very difficult. You make a lot of mistakes. But as you practice, your playing gets smoother. Eventually, you play beautiful music. It's the same with English." Then Mrs. Miller pauses, looking around the room. Would anyone here feel nervous playing the piano for the first time in front of other people? Everyone nods, including me. She smiles. "See? It's normal to feel nervous, but don't let that stop you. Mistakes help you learn. If you avoid mistakes, you avoid learning." Jin, who sits in the back row, raises his hand. "Mrs. Miller, I read a lot in English, but I still find speaking hard. What should I do?" "Good question, Jin," Mrs. Miller replies. "Reading is a great way to improve. When you read, you see new words, you learn grammar, and your English gets better. If you want, you can read aloud. That helps you practice pronunciation. Another great technique is shadowing. You listen to someone speaking and repeat what they say right after them. It can help you get used to the rhythm and flow of English." Jin nods, understanding. Then Mrs. Miller continues, when you're in a real conversation, don't worry about grammar or vocabulary. Just focus on sharing your ideas. Speaking with others is about communication, not perfection. Sarah looks thoughtful and asks, but won't people think I sound funny if I make a lot of mistakes? Mrs. Miller shakes her head. Not at all. Think about famous people who speak in public, like politicians or business leaders. They make mistakes, too. When you watch them on TV, do you see them stop every time they say something wrong? No, we all reply together. Exactly, Mrs. Miller says. They just keep going. They focus on their message, not on being perfect. You can do the same thing. The most important part is sharing your ideas. People will understand what you mean, even if there are a few mistakes. The class is quiet, thinking about her words. I feel a bit better. Maybe mistakes aren't so terrible after all. Then Mrs. Miller says, I have a challenge for all of you. This week, I want you to try speaking English outside of class, even if it's just for a few minutes. You can talk to a friend, a family member, or even try saying your thoughts out loud to yourself. Don't worry about making mistakes. Just focus on saying what you want to say. I think about the challenge and decide I'll try it. Maybe I can practice with Sarah at lunch. I turn to her and whisper, let's try speaking in English to each other during lunch. We'll help each other and not worry about mistakes. Sarah smiles and nods. That sounds good. We'll get better together. Mrs. Miller sees us talking and adds, and remember, if you want to reduce mistakes, reading and shadowing are very helpful. Try reading short stories or news articles in English. And when you shadow, it's okay if you can't keep up at first. Just repeat 1 or 2 words. Soon, you'll be able to follow along more easily. As the class ends, I feel more confident. Mistakes don't seem as scary anymore. And I know that I have friends like Sarah and a teacher like Mrs. Miller who will support me.